change corners of your sponge or whatever you're using. So now I'm going to use this very thin piece of sponge. It's about 5 millimeters thick. And I'm going to use that to help do these creases. So it's another way you can do it without using the brush. If it's going to work for me. There's a little bit of paint that's come off the brush onto parts of his nose. I'm just trying to, around the eye, that I'm just trying to even out. And then I'll turn him around and show you what we have. So this is, I'll turn him around and show you exactly how to do it with a thin piece of sponge. So you want to dip the sponge into your paint mixture. So swirl it around because we haven't touched it in a couple of minutes. Make sure it's clean. Dip it in, then wring it out like we always do. So we're going to do the bridge of the nose. It's super deep. Just put it on the bridge of the nose with the edge of the sponge, so the very edge. And that will get in there. Because you've wrung it out, you can push it in a bit harder in the corners of the eyes and into the creases under the eyes. See how he's got super deep creases in there? If you have good quality brushes, it won't be a problem. You can just do it with a brush. Now, you could forget before you bake, and then you'll have clumps, and clumps are not nice. Gone and got a new brush out of the drawer. This is one of the watercolor brushes, so you can fill the tube to do it. It's got a nice fine point. So I will use this brush for this bit to get in those creases. We'll use it again later to do all the other creases on the kit. And then for a few other little details as well, including in the mouth. Grab his head again. I'm going to swirl the paint a little, dip the brush in, gently tap it on the sponge to get rid of any excess, and then we're just going to go right now over the bridge of the nose, which is super deep, to help get the paint in there. There's something in there. Oh, there we go. I think we've got it out. It's just this little of something. Okay, sorry, there was something on the kit. So you've got that in there, like that. And then you want to do the same thing, get a little bit of the mixture on the brush, dab off any excess, and go into all the deep creases on his face. If your kit doesn't have super deep creases like this one, you shouldn't need to do this little bit. Crease above the eye, but also at the edges of his eye, trying to, just in that little bit there, you want to get right in there. You don't want to miss any little pieces. We are going to do a little bit inside the nose in a minute. Done that. We will dab at this with a sponge to remove any brush marks after. So we're going to do under the chin, the dip in his chin that's like above his chin, I guess. Sorry, just another black spot on the kit. Then in the crease under the chin. We will do more in creases later with slightly thicker paint. piece of fur that isn't coming off. Tweezers come in really handy for getting pieces of fur off, but we don't have any. Once you've used the brush to get paint into all of the creases, we're then going to go over it with a toothpick to make sure that there is no excess paint. So I've just used the brush to do the corners of the mouth, not on the lips, just the corners of the mouth, the top of the chin, under the chin, just like that. Just make sure around the creases around the eyes as well, you don't have any clumps. Actually doesn't, which is good. So we're going to get that really small sponge and just dab around that area. So anywhere any of those creases you just did, just to make sure that there's no brush marks. So just even those out and there won't be any brush marks. Okay, and then we're going to get that brush again. So stir your paint, dip your brush in, take off any excess. Now I'm using a quite pointy brush. Hold his head upside down, carefully put the brush up the nostril, and I put the tip of the brush in the very end of the nostril, so as far as it'll go without bending the tip, and then I carefully press down and swirl it around a little. You need to do that a couple of times. You don't want your brush wet or you're going to end up with a puddle inside the nostril, and then it'll run out and down your kit. I'm going to do that a few times between doing different layers as well. So the next thing we're going to do is the ears. So I've got one ear facing me. So I'm going to use that same mixture, get a bit on your brush, and do the very inside of the ear, just dabbing, not wiping. Gently so you don't ruin your brush. Don't want your brush too wet or it will pull inside creases on your ear. You can also use this brush to do around the edge of your ear, dabbing, not stroking. You'll find certain parts of a kit seem to not really take the paint as much. Like around the edge of the ear sometimes is hard to get paint to stick to. The tip of the nose, tips of fingers and toes can also be hard to get paint to really stick to. Sometimes you need to add a little extra paint to those. But that's something I will delve into later. We've added a little bit of colour into that ear and around that side of that ear. Then we turn your kit around and do the exact same to the other ear. Again, making sure you don't have too much already on your brush. Another thing you can do is brush it on, because this ear doesn't really have much on it. You couldn't do this on the cheek or anything. And then once it's on, you can dab it to do the texture. If you're dabbing too hard, you can damage your brush. And then you'll have to use a different brush again for other areas. Whereas I will be able to use this brush for quite a few different things using similar colours to this. So that's a little bit in the ears done, so that they match the rest of the body. Well, the rest of the head, sorry. Have a look over your head now before you move on to your limbs, keeping your sponge. If you see any little spots of paint, I think you can see one just in there, just carefully go over it with your sponge to thin it out and blend it in. Don't want any globs of paint. also going to go over the face one more time with this sponge. And then get your brush again. Just keep going until you feel like it looks right. So the next bit I'm doing is just this little bit around the curve of the nose. So I forgot to do that crease before. Just any spots that you can see that you haven't got as much of this blushing colour on, just quickly go over them with the brush, dabbing, not stroking. And then once you're happy with that, or even if you're not, if you overdo it while it's wet, you can just be taking paint off instead of evening it out. Sometimes it's better let it evaporate and then come back to it. Or if you just think that there's not enough colouring, leave it. Do the layer on everything else included with the kit. Bake it if you're only not happy with it because it's too pale. Bake it and then do another layer. That way you're not taking off the previous layer as you're trying to add a new layer. So with him, he is a little paler on his face, doesn't have as much mottling effect, but it still looks really good. So I am going to go over him again, but with a very, very diluted version of this colour, just to even out any teeny tiny clumps that could be on there before I bake. Because if you bake and there are teeny tiny clumps, you cannot get them off. So I'm going to quickly do a foot and then quickly do a hand, and then I'll turn the camera off and do the rest of the limbs. Only because there's certain parts of the foot and hand you want to do and certain parts you don't want to do with this. So start with the foot. So with the foot, I'm going to use the same sponge. You only want to do the heel, up the side of the foot, bottom of the toes, and here. You don't want to go over this blue bit. That's what I'm going to do now. I forgot to put paint on my sponge. Swirl your paint around. Again, don't have too much on your sponge. Just quickly do that, and then I will show you. So I've only done the very edges around that foot. Can't really see it in the picture. I don't know what's going on with this camera. But the creases on the bottom of your foot, you will need to use the brush you've been using for this, for the creases on the face, to get into the creases on the foot where you've painted, under the toes as well, because he's got scrunched up toes. You can brush it a little bit, only in the very creases, and don't push down hard on your brush, and then go along and dab it with your brush. You will be doing a lot more layers, so it won't be super red yet. It won't be, too much of a change, but there is quite a change in the kit from this layer and the previous layer. Now I'll show you on a hand. I've just noticed a little bit I need to even out on that foot. So now I'll show you how to do that on the hand, and then I'll turn the camera off, do the full limbs, and come back. Paintbrush is stuck inside it. so with the hand, as you can already see, you've got the blue bit in the middle, which you do not want to be painting over. You want to be doing this part, so this part here, up here, across the palm, or the top of here, not in that little blue triangle, and then on the bottoms of the fingers. So you can use the big sponge still, just wet it, bring it out. I use the big sponge to get it initially on there, and I will use a different sponge to even it out because this sponge is too big. So then I get my itty bitty sponge and go over it. Doesn't matter, well, you won't need the mottling effect of the big sponge on this bit. You can use a paintbrush to get the paint onto this section, which is something I have done before. I will be using a brush to get paint in between the fingers, or you can use this teeny tiny sponge that we have. So if you're going to use the teeny tiny sponge to get in between the fingers, do it very carefully because you don't want to rub, or you don't want to rub with your finger accidentally because you will take paint off. So he's got very separated fingers, which is a good thing sometimes and a bad thing sometimes. Just trying to get a little, I don't even know what that is. Oh, it's a little bit of pigment. I don't know how that got on there. There we go. It's gone now. So I'm going to use the itty bitty sponge to do the fingers. Just because you can do a smaller area with more control without getting onto bits that you don't want this paint on. Dip my sponge in again and go over it. Going to use a different edge now just to even that out because I had a little bit of excess paint on the sponge that wasn't diluted properly. I will turn the hand around and show you in a second. Okay, so that's the palm of the hand so far. That really big crease just in here. I'm going to show you. Should be able to. This big crease here, and then the crease that goes down there, you will need a paintbrush to do. So use the same brush that you were using for creases before, dip it in your paint, blot it on your brush, and then use it to go over that. If your brush is too wet, again, the paint will pool and you don't want that to happen. You can then go over it with a brush that has no color on it and no paint. This one's a bit big, but I'm using it as an example. So I'm just going to gently touch the creases I just did to absorb any extra liquid or paint, just like that. And that'll help stop paint pooling as well. So having a dry brush can be very handy. So I'm going to go and finish all of that. So doing that on the other limbs, and then I'll come back and show you what we've got. So I've done all of the limbs. The creases I've put a bit of colour into, not as the creasing layer, but just so that it's not still blank. We will do creases separately later to enhance them. So the paint has evaporated from the head, or the thinner. Don't know if you're going to be able to see it through the camera, but there are very tiny, and I mean tiny, spots of undiluted paint. Don't know if you can. Just smacked him in the head with his own foot. You can't see it in the camera, but I can notice it. So I'm just going to walk you through how to fix that. So I had to remake some extra paint. We're not going to use that all. So we're going to make a very diluted cup of paint. So I'm going to take a little bit of this and pour it into a separate container or all over your board, which is what I've just done. Cool, so most of that went on my board instead of in the container. As you can see, it's barely any in there because most of it's on my board. And then we're going to use just plain stuff to really dilute it. On its own as a layer, this would not be effective because it wouldn't really give much colour. The reason we're putting some colour into it is to prevent it just taking off the whole layer you have done. So dip it in, rinse your sponge out, then just work your sponge over those areas you just did that look like there's a bit of clumpy paint. It'll help break those clumps up and even it out. You can also use a paintbrush, a stiff paintbrush to work through it as well. Again, you don't want to go over the one spot too many times with the wet sponge, or you can ruin the effect of the mottling. This will not increase the colour. It's just spreading out the colour that's already there to help even it out a little bit. There are a couple more things I'm going to do to the head before the next bake, just so that I'm happy with it. A lot of it is all discretionary. You don't have to do what I'm about to do, but it's mostly just to make you happy with your baby. You don't want to bake it and then go, oh, I should have really evened that bit out. So I'm going to get my two brushes. So the brush I'm doing the creases with, and then my stiff, wider dry brush. I'm going to dip it into the darker pot of paint. Swirl it around before you do it. Take off excess and go behind the ears again, because they're still quite pale. You can go a little bit out of the ears. So if you're going to do a little bit away from the ears, dab instead of brush. You can fix the evenness of that out after. Really have to make sure you get creases, or you're going to have patches that are still the plain vinyl colour. Do a little bit more in the ears. Now I'll get my dry brush. This helps prevent you having the pulled spots of paint in your creases. Just going to go around all the creases I just did behind this ear. Any slightly thicker pieces as well. I'm trying to find a spot that I can try and show you, but I've pretty much evened that out. So let that evaporate. Always let it evaporate because it appears slightly different once the thinner has evaporated. And so once the thinner has evaporated, oops, it does look slightly different. So it has evaporated on the limbs. Don't compare your limbs to your head or a limb to another limb if one of them is evaporated and one isn't, because it will look completely different. So you can compare dry limbs to each other, so they are the same. If you can, I have to turn the camera, hang on. I need to be an octopus to do this. If you try to compare the limb to the head at the moment, it will look different, only because the head is wet. Back, there we go. Just looking over it to see if there's any bits of pulled paint, anything that's not blended at all. This arm is stuck. The arm keeps getting stuck. I'm gonna have to swap it around. Oh, I've already had to look at that limb. You don't really want to touch the part you've painted very much when it's not baked. Should be able to see. This part that we've painted is now very different to the part that's not painted. And that's exactly what you want. We're by no means anywhere finished. We've still got more flesh layers to do. There'll be some blushing layers. Sorry, you can't see my full head. There'll be some blushing layers in certain areas. If you want your baby more mottled than what it already is, you have a couple of different ways you can do it. I don't think I'm going to do much more mottling on him myself. So if you want your baby more mottled than what it is at the moment, that's fine. Personal choices. So I'm really happy with the mottling on the head, but I'm kind of thinking the limbs need to be a little bit more mottled. So I'm going to go over that with the exact same layer I just did, just to make it match the head a bit more. Because the head is, it's almost evaporated, but the head is slightly different to the limbs. Sorry, as I was saying before I got distracted. If you want a lot more mottling effect, you can then go to another purple mottle, again, very thin, and then do the red again. Or you can just add more red mottle. It's totally up to you, and it depends on what kind of effect and skin tone you are wanting. But don't do that yet. So after this layer, so I will increase the colouring on the limbs because they're not even with the head at the moment. And that's because I had to remix the paint. So it was a little bit more diluted than the paint I used on the head. And then I'm going to bake the baby so that this layer is set. And if I decide to do another mottling layer, I can do it. And then if I think it's too much, I can wash that off without damaging the layers I've just done. So again, less is more. The head is almost ready for baking. The limbs, I am going to do another layer on, but I thought I'd quickly video this first so I don't have to stop again. I'm going to add a little bit of colour to the inside of the mouth and the lips. So I'm using the exact same pot we've just used to do the red mottling layer. I'm using our creases brush. You don't want too much on your brush, so dab it on your sponge. And then I do the inside of the mouth first. And then very carefully go over the lips. When doing lips, it's even more important to use thin layers. If you use thick layers, it will look like your baby is wearing makeup or lipstick, however you want to put it. So I'll go over with the brush that has the paint on it. And then I'm going to go over with the dry brush because there's little creases in the lips and you don't want paint to pull in those or in the inside of the mouth, which is a very small pulled piece in there. Like that. I'm mostly concentrating on the inside of the mouth with slightly thicker paint. So you can grab a little bit of paint on the very tip of your brush straight out of your pot, like that. Dab it on your sponge for the very inside of the mouth. And just dab that in there. Don't leave clumps, work it all the way through on the entire inside of the mouth. Then wet your sponge in the super, super diluted stuff to help mix that through. Again, you don't want too much on your brush or you will cause pulling in the mouth. And then when you turn the head up the right way, it's just going to run down the paintwork you've done and can cause issues. Get your dry brush again now. Just gently in the corners of the mouth and the inside of the mouth, get any excess paint. I'm going to go over the lips one more time now that it's evaporated. I know I just missed the lip. If you accidentally go above the lip line, get your dry brush and just carefully dab it off. Sorry, I can't really talk and concentrate at the same time. I can sing along with music and type a message at the same time, which apparently is weird. But talking and concentrating don't work. And before I fix it, I'll show you. So in the lip, you can kind of see how the creases have got a bit of clumped paint in the lips, and then in the creases at the edges of the mouth. That's what you use your dry brush for, just to break them down. You don't want to use the dry brush too much because it can take paint off. So we've added a little bit of colour to the lips. They're not as pale. It is only very faint, and that is all you want. We will build it up later, but if you do it super thick layers or too many layers in between baking, it will look like your baby's wearing makeup. So I'm just going to use that dry brush again. There's a couple of spots on top of the head that are a bit too weird, I guess. Okay. So I'm going to work on the limbs again now to make them match the colouring of my head. It's something that can happen when you mix a new pot of paint. Like if you do the head and say one limb and run out of paint, so you have to mix more. It can happen, and it is easy to fix. I'm about to bake my kit, but I remembered that I needed to show you how to fix the cave-in the kit's head if that happens. It usually only happens if you've cooked your kit too long, or if, like I did, you leave it laying on its side while it's cooling down. So, because this layer is not baked, it is important that I don't touch the painted area. This can wait until after you've baked the baby. So, you can bake the baby, let it cool, then do this. But I just thought I'd do it now. So I'm going to very carefully hold the head, because again, it's not baked. I'm going to use the hobby fell, or fibre fell, to put it inside the head. This is totally safe to go into your convection oven. You can't have it up near the element, of course. But it'll be fine inside the head to be baked with. It does have to be kept away from open flames and stuff, of course. But yeah. You're going to need to use quite a bit, because you're pushing the side of the head back into position. Just trying to do this without really touching the head. And he's sitting in my hand, but I've got to be careful not to move his head around in my hand, because it will rub paint off. Just push that in. So you can see that's pushing the sunken side back out. You don't want it to bulge the head out, just enough to push the bit out, so that just needs a little bit more. Push that side out a little bit. And then I'm going to go over him like we have in the previous bake to make sure there are no pulled spots of paint in creases or anywhere on your kit. I won't film that because I've already filmed it. Okay. So that looks almost normal. So you've got the normal side, the sunken side, and that looks fairly normal. It may never go completely back to normal, but you don't want to overstuff it. If you can get your hands on a pair of hemostats, which are kind of like really long tweezer type things, so it's a flat, almost duck beak on a very long stem. They come in handy for getting stuffing in and out of heads. So his head is a normal shape now, so I'll bake him with that inside, and when the vinyl heats up, it'll be looser and it'll mold to this shape, and as it cools down, it'll keep the shape. So I'm going to go do that and then I'll come back. Hey all, just a very quick little bit. So these 3 sections have been baked. Just wanted to quickly reiterate, this is the correct way to have the head standing after you have baked the baby, to prevent the head caving in like mine did. And the reason it caved in, as I said, was because I had it laying flat and had to quickly rush off and deal with an injured pet. Another thing about this Sunbeam Nutri oven is it has some safety features. So if you don't have this back handle down, it will turn off like this. So it's just completely turned off. If you have one of these dials that isn't on, again, it will not turn on. So you can turn the heat dial on and put this down, but it won't start unless the timer is put on. Yeah. So as you're baking a baby, if you've got to sit here and keep an eye on it. If you notice your baby's starting to get a shiny spot, just quickly turn your oven off, take the lid off, and flip the vinyl piece over. Use your tongs and just carefully flip it over. You don't normally have to turn the pieces in the oven. They will bake all the way through, both sides. But if you're getting a shiny spot on one side, flip it over and it takes the intense heat from that top side off and applies it to the other side to sort of prevent extra shiny spots, because it means that particular piece of vinyl is getting too hot. I usually find that happens on the ears because I lay my head on the side, or on the tip of the nose if you lay your head so that it's laying on the back of the head.